Welcome to the CondoVultures.com podcast with your host, Peter Zalewski, a Miami real estate broker, Wall Street consultant, and expert witness. This podcast is focused on identifying real estate buying opportunities in the South Florida condo market of Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. The CondoVultures.com podcast is not authorized by the South Florida real estate industry and will most likely annoy many of the region's talking heads. This podcast will feature straight talk and salty language that could be offensive to some. Please remember that past investment success does not determine future gains, especially in South Florida's volatile condo market. For more information, please visit CondoVultures.com.
Welcome to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. If you're tuning into this podcast, you're going to hear a conversation by current and former journalists talking about some of the biggest real estate and economic stories that have occurred within the last week that could be impacting investors as well as professionals, as well as those on the sidelines who are paying attention to what's going on in the South Florida market. What we're going to do for this particular podcast is I've handpicked 6 stories. I'm going to ask each of our 3 journalists to go ahead and give us their opinion. Then near the end of the podcast, we're going to turn around. We're going to ask each of them for words of wisdom as we sit here at the end of the first quarter in 2023. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our journalists. We're going to start off with a gentleman who's been a journalist for 25 years, 20 years of which were in the state of Florida. Right now he has a public relations and marketing firm called Gruss Communications. It's no one else but John Gruss. What's going on, John?
Thanks for having me, Peter. I just got back from a real estate conference in Fort Myers where things are really hot.
Wow. Interesting. Well, I'm definitely going to want to hear about that later on in the podcast. If anybody wants to reach out to Jean, they could go online. His website is grusspr.com. That's GRUSSPR.com. Grusspr.com. Who else do we have? We have a gentleman who's a journalist for 20 years. He wrote about white collar crime. He wrote about business stories. He also actually did restaurant reviews. I wouldn't trust his opinion on that, but that being said, now he has a public relations consulting firm. His name is John Fakler. If you want to get a hold of John Fakler, you can get him at fakler@consultant.com. That's singular. Fakler, Fakler @consultant.com. What's going on, Mr. Fakler?
Hey, Peter. Great to be back on the Unauthorized podcast.
Great to have you. I noticed you have a New York City-ish shirt on. I'm assuming that's because a quarterback from the Green Bay Packers has just moved over to the dark side, if you will.
And just to be clear, because I know we have a lot of Miami Dolphin fans watching our program, we got Rodgers right here, boy. I might keep the hat on because my hair's all over the place today. Okay.
Which is a great time to bring up the fact that if you want to send a comment to us, you want to ask a question, send all emails to inquiry@condovultures.com. That's INQUIRY@condovultures.com. And then our rotating journalist at one point was my boss. He's been a journalist for 4+ decades. Right now, he currently works at the South Florida SunSentinel, where he's a business writer. It's David Lyons. Anyone in the journalism world in South Florida would definitely recognize David's name. We're lucky enough to have him join us for our unauthorized podcast. What's going on, Mr. Lyons?
Pleasure to be here. Talking about the financial system and how the economy is going to hold up under the latest crisis.
That's why we thought it would be fantastic to have you on for this particular podcast because of everything going on with Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse, Silvergate, all that type of stuff. Between you and Jean, it's going to get very interesting. If anybody wants to reach David, if you want to reach out to him, you can send him an email at D like David, V like Victor, Lyons @sunsentinel.com. Lyons is LYONS. So it's DV Lyons @sunsentinel.com. One last tidbit before we go ahead and take our first commercial break, and we'll get into our first 3 stories. If you're listening to this podcast on a traditional platform, such as Apple, such as Google, such as Spotify, Anchor, anything like that, you want to actually watch the podcast. You want to see the faces behind the voices. Not all of them are necessarily worth seeing, but if you do decide to tune in for that, simply go to a platform that provides for video, such as Spotify. You want to check us out on YouTube. Our handle is Condo Vultures TV, Condo Vultures TV. So that being said, we're going to take our first commercial break. Other side of the break, we're going to get into our first 3 stories.
It's a simple formula and it works. Buy low, sell high. We're Condo Vultures, and when it comes to your real estate, we help you buy low. At Condo Vultures, we represent the buyer, and now's the time to buy. Log on to condovultures.com for more information. Condovultures.com. And remember, before you sell high, you have to buy low. Featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes, and Time Magazine. Condo Vultures Realty, a licensed Florida real estate brokerage capitalizing on the condo correction since 2006.
Welcome back to the Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. I handpicked 6 articles. I've sent them off to the journalists. They each got 2. And we're going to go ahead. We're going to talk about the stories, and we're going to talk about what's really going on sort of behind the scenes, or what's their take on it. Let's cast a skeptical or a cynical eye as to what these stories are, cut through some of the fluff, and help you, the audience, understand what really the takeaway is from it all. Where else to start but with Silicon Valley Bank, with Silvergate Bank, and right now, as we're recording this, an institution out of Switzerland is on the brink. Needless to say, we are on the cusp of a banking crisis, not only in the United States, but globally. So we're going to go to David Lyons with the first story, which, by the way, happens to be about bank failures and how it's impacting people in South Florida. So, David, I'll read the headline, first couple of graphs, and I'm going to ask you to provide any comment you can. Granted, you wrote the story, so you might not be able to comment, but you can definitely give us insight. So here we go. It comes from the South Florida SunSentinel. Headline: Banks seek to reassure South Florida depositors their accounts are safe. First couple of graphs. There's no need for South Florida consumers to make a run on their local banks, even though the stock prices of few financial institutions, large and small, took a pounding on Wall Street. And industry executives and advisors said Monday, between federal insurance and of the reached financial institution, bank customers can be confident that their money is safe after regulators took over 2 banks in California and New York during the weekend. We have a quote from a very prominent banking analyst and advisor down here in South Florida, a guy called Ken Thomas. Here's this quote: "The depositors have nothing to be concerned about because all of our banks in South Florida are very strong. Any bank with an FDIC label is really safe." David, can you tell us about what you found out while you were reporting out this story?
Well, I think it was due to, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think it was due to the action that the Treasury and the Fed and the White House on the weekend. Most of the people I spoke with on Monday said that those types of backstopping actions, they took a couple of directions. One was to protect the depositors who had more than $250,000, which is a cap of the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insurance fund. For deposit, they essentially, for the people who, the many technologists, the businesses, and the investors and others who had money on deposit in Silicon Valley, where the insurance, they essentially took the lid, off the cap, so that because a lot of those people were businesses who had a lot more than $250,000 on deposit there. The second thing was that the regulators set up a path for other banks that might be in need of funding to borrow money for about a year. They didn't identify any banks. There was a recognition that there were a number of other banks that were under stress. As far as Florida banks, from the Florida Bankers Association, Mr. Thomas, and a variety of others, indicated that have a good handle on their capital requirements. Of course, many of the people who are depositors here in South Florida do not have more than $250,000 in the bank. So, by and large, most all the institutions that I've heard about, here in the state, are in good shape. Not like a real estate driven 2008 scenario. I mean, a lot of the trouble that arose from housing crash of more than almost a couple decades ago.
Yep.
And it's not, they're not synonymous. This is a technology that collapsed. They were heavily reliant on the technology business. The other bank, Silvergate Bank in New York, was a cryptocurrency oriented bank. And then there was a third bank as well that also had heavy reliance on the cryptocurrency space, which, as we all know, is a very shaky space. So the bottom line was that there were a lot, on the day that I reported that story, a lot of the banking executives were on the phones to their clients. One in particular, a bank called Locality Bank, a new one up here in Fort Lauderdale, help small businesses. It's mainly an online bank, even though they have a brick and mortar office in the middle of town. The CEO of that bank, Keith Costello, was out on the phone early in the morning before dawn to all of his clients, telling them that we're a new bank, we're well capitalized, we have great liquidity. We don't have an investment portfolio like Silicon Valley Bank. They sent that letter out to all, and they made it public. They shared a copy with me, and we discussed it. And then there are other individuals who advise the banking industry, and one gentleman told me that for a large law firm who specializes in the banking institutions, that that he felt that the Florida Banking Association and the whole community on that day were very aggressive in reaching out to their clients to ensure them that their deposits were sound and that the institutions in which the money was held are also sound.
David, if I could, I'd like to ask you one question, and I want to go to Jean after that. Because Jean wrote about banking when he was a journalist before he set up his firm. Some of the stuff I've heard, David, is what made this run on the bank different than maybe what we saw occur back in 2008 after Lehman Brothers failure, is that social media was able to spread the word, hey, get your money out of so-and-so bank. And as a result, people basically, not only did they show up at the branches, but also they were able to transfer stuff using their phone as well as their computer. Did any of the institutions or any people from institutions you spoke to, did they talk about that little difference in terms of how everything is real time now? And if they want to pull their cash out, they can pretty much do it pretty quick after taking a lunch break, reading on Twitter that some bank's in trouble. And then lo and behold, they get online while they're eating their sub, if you will, and they can withdraw all their cash. Did any of that come up whatsoever?
Costello did. I mean, I think he's essentially an online banker. I mean, most of the clients do business with him online. That he does have a brick and mortar office in the middle of Fort Lauderdale, but his principal methodology of dealing with his clients is in cyberspace. So I think he was he was in California actually on a business trip. So he was essentially up all night. He getting out in front of this thing because he understood how quickly the firestorm of rumor, innuendo, and panic could spread social media. They all sort. I mean, the great irony that the condition of SVB was out there for all to see. When they issued their financial reports, their interest rate driven portfolio, the interest rate, their failure to manage interest rate situation with their portfolio was there. Nobody really took a look at it, but I think it was exactly that. Through Twitter and other social media, word got out about the fact that the bank could not. Everybody wanted their money back on a given. The bank's asset portfolio could not cover it because prices of the bond investment had gone down. Interest rates had gone up as a result of the Federal Reserve Act to control inflation.
Jean, I want to ask you that, I wanted to dedicate time to this story because it could be one of those critical moments in the overall economy as we go forward. There's talk about interest rates possibly not having to be jacked up anymore. We probably are going to see some layoffs. We're going to see a whole variety of slowdown. We could see inflation pull back. But John, the question I want to ask you, and you wrote about banking, you've written about finance for quite some time, and I've heard people refer to this. John, take yourself back to 2008. There was an investment bank called Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns ran into trouble. The federal government backstopped Bear Stearns, allowed them to fight another day. 6 months later, in September of 2008, an investment bank called Lehman Brothers was not backstopped, ultimately went BK, and as a result, the U.S. and possibly even the global financial system was on the brink. So my question to you, Jean, is Silicon Valley Bank, which is now gone, Do you see any similarities where maybe, you can send in the cavalry on the first, but then as things play out, maybe there's not enough money in the till or in the coffers or in the vault to be able to have the backstop. So is this a one and done, do you think, based on what we saw back in 2008? Or do you think that the feds and the financial system has learned from what happened in 2008 and how critical it is to keep everybody in place?
Well, it depends. It depends who you're talking to. And I mean, Silicon Valley Bank was a bit of an unusual anomaly in that it was really very a niche bank. And you deal with the clubby sort of atmosphere of Silicon Valley where everybody knows each other. And basically, they were forcing companies that they gave loans to keep their deposits there. So it was a bit of a, it was a very clubby atmosphere. And so when the rumors start going out in the tech world, they spread like wildfire. But, I was just recalling in 2008, 2009, when I was a reporter, I hated Fridays because every Friday afternoon, a bank was shut down by the FDIC, and there goes my weekend. So Friday afternoon, 5:00, invariably another community bank in Florida would be shut down, and by Monday, the deposits and the loans would be assumed by a new entity. It would be sold by the FDIC over the weekend, and you'd move on to the next bank the next week, next Friday, another failure. So in fact, I was just looking back at the FDIC website actually keeps a tally of all the bank failures since 2000. You can go back, and I think the latest number was 571 banks have failed since 2000. So I mean, this is not, banks failing are not. I mean, they're not a common occurrence, but I mean, it happens more often than perhaps people think. And usually the FDIC and the regulators step in, and then they sell the deposits and they sell the loans to a competitor. And so generally speaking, the machine works, so I really don't see, something more serious. I mean, obviously there are companies, if you keep more than $250,000 in a single financial institution, now you've got to think about risk. And that's really up to, that's good, sound business management. And also the banks and the bankers, they've had at least a year to prepare for this. The Federal Reserve has been telling us for at least a year that they're going to raise rates. I mean, it seems to me that if I'm a prudent banker, I would have started long ago to plan for this. And then when the rates were actually going up, well, you got to manage your balance sheet. I mean, it just seems like prudent banking and something Silicon Valley Bank didn't, and a few other banks have not really paid close attention to. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
Interesting. And for the record, Silicon Valley Bank's failure was the second largest bank failure since Washington Mutual failed. And if you remember that back in the day, back in the Great Recession. So it definitely had tonnage, as the New Yorkers like to say. It also was a top 20 bank in the United States. Story number 2. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, people are able to go back to Silicon Valley, have returned. Doors are open in their business, and it's underway, and people have access to the money. But they've got a long way to go in terms of recovery. Obviously, the people who were running the bank last week are not going to be running the bank anytime in the near future.
Absolutely.
In fact, there are some people who are saying, to avoid something like this in the future, and particularly if the business, do not keep all of your eggs in one basket. Maintain multiple banking relationships across maybe 2 or 3 institutions instead of just one.
Great insight. John, we're going to go to you with story number 2. This is coming out of the Miami Herald. So the headline, elite gathering of financial titans returns to Miami for annual event. I'll read you the first couple of graphs, Sean, and I want you to comment. Influential hedge fund titans, investment bankers, and private equity giants have moved to or opened up shop in Miami over the past 2 years. Now, a group born in the country's hedge fund capital of the world is recognizing the rapidly growing finance industry here and the city's rising importance in global business. The 6-year-old Greenwich Economic Forum is set to hold an annual conference in Miami. It was on Monday for the second straight year. Miami is the only city outside of Greenwich, Connecticut, where the organization hosts an event. The original one is held each October in Greenwich. John, there's been a lot of talk about how Miami is really sort of emerging and South Florida is emerging as this hub, this capital, whether it's downtown West Palm Beach, it's Fort Lauderdale, it's Brickell Avenue, it's the Gables. What do you think this shows that there's an event going on now for the second straight year? What does this represent? And does this remind you of Art Basel, which started about 20 years ago as a one-off, and then lo and behold, it turned into a major draw. So what's your take on that, John?
Yeah, well, everybody's here. I mean, would you rather be in freezing cold Greenwich or nice balmy Miami if you're a hedge fund investor? I mean, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but obviously a lot of hedge funds from the Northeast and from the Midwest have opened up offices in South Florida during the pandemic and to escape high taxes in northern states, and for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, Ken Griffin of Citadel being the most notable, moving his firm from Chicago to Miami for a host of reasons. And I think they're here. They're all here. So why not? Why go to freezing cold Greenwich when you can be out here, down here, enjoy the golf course, the nice weather, and do business, because everybody's here already.
So John Fakler, we're going to go to you with story number 3. This is coming out of the Daily Mail from the United Kingdom. Speaking of everybody here, and remember, this is spring break, the start of spring break. So that's the backdrop. Here we go. It's kind of a long headline. David, when he was my editor, there's no way he would have approved this as a prose headline, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyways. Not down in Acapulco. Thousands heed warnings to avoid Mexico as spring breakers descend on Florida beaches as Miami is set for a record arrivals. Here we go. 3 points, John, that the story includes. Spring breakers have flocked to Florida to bask by the beach in their bikinis. Point number 2, the full beaches suggest some have followed U.S. government warnings about traveling to Mexico for spring break over fears of safety from cartel violence. As you remember, 2 people recently were murdered. Some people drove down from the East Coast of the United States to Mexico. There was going to be some kind of medical procedure. Lo and behold, there was kidnappings, and 2 of the 4 were ultimately murdered. And then point number 3 from the story, John, but some spring breakers have nonetheless flocked to Cancun, Mexico. So, John, rather than getting into the story, I want you to give us some take, because we spent a lot of time on the banking story. Last year during the pandemic, state of Florida was open. Therefore, many spring breakers came to Florida. We had all kind of videos that went viral of people twerking on tops of Miami Beach police cars. There were just flash mobs here and there and all kinds of stories. The residents of the city of Miami Beach moved to try to reduce the liquor license times from 5 a.m. in the morning last call to 2 a.m. Last week during the podcast, we talked about Jeffrey Sofer of Condo Development fame buying the property where his nightclub Story is located. John, what do you make of the fact that not only is Miami in South Florida, everybody knows the Fort Lauderdale story, a very popular place, but now some of those spring breakers who might have thought about going to Mexico are now being told by the U.S. government it's simply not safe. Do not go. So, John, what's your
First off, why do you always give me these crazy stories? But no, I definitely. There's some very interesting nuggets in this story. First off, as many people know, South Florida was the go-to destination for spring break for Lauderdale, Miami, South Beach. There was a big blowback from the locals because there was too much crime, too much traffic. So eventually, a lot of the spring breakers started to go to Mexico, Cancun, some other popular destinations. And then, of course, the cartel business started up. We had the recent news story, obviously, where 4 people were kidnapped and 2 killed. And, apparently we're starting to get the spring breakers back in South Florida because of the government here, warning about what's going on. Stay away from the cartels. They actually mentioned that just about every state in Mexico has a cartel problem. There's a real push to get people to not go to Mexico. Interesting nugget in the story was the president of Mexico went apeshit, excuse my language, saying that, in fact, the United States has a worse crime problem. But in fact, the numbers show. They had a study that showed it's much worse in Mexico than it is here. So, you've got this issue, and then you have the odd situation where the kidnappers came out and apologized. They said they were sorry, the cartel, that they did this. And I started wondering, I says, what the hell would they, say they were sorry? I mean, why are they even getting involved? And I'm connecting the dots here. I'm wondering, tourism is probably the biggest business for Mexico. And the government is probably not too happy that got out, that the cartels kidnapped these people, and that there would be an influx, or I should say, an exodus away from Mexico, whether it's to South Florida or wherever else. So I'm not making any, accusations. I don't need the cartel showing up to my apartment here in Little Havana, but there might be a connection there. I don't know, because like I said, tourism is such a huge industry in Mexico, and I'm sure they weren't happy about this getting out, about the kidnappings by the cartel.
In sort of interesting, there were some stories that came out about how members of Congress are moving to actually send in the U.S. military to try to bring some law and order to Mexico. So that's another factor. We're going to go ahead. We're going to take our commercial break. Other side of the break, we're going to get into our next three stories. This is Peter Zalewski of the Condo Vultures podcast. I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And I wanted to alert you that if you have a property that you're looking to sell in the Tri-County, South Florida area, I would encourage you to reach out to Jenny Cortez, a licensed real estate broker with CVRrealty.com. She's my partner. She's been in the business for north of 15 years. More importantly, she knows the market. She knows how to get a deal done. And she also realizes that it's more important to get a price that you can accept and sell the property rather than to hold firm on some price that's never going to be achieved and ultimately languish on the market. So if you're looking to do a deal that you want a skilled expert who can help you sell a property, reach out to Jenny Cortez at 305-865-5859, 305-865-5859, or visit her website, cvrrealty.com. Welcome back to the Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. As I mentioned previously, if you want to send a comment to us, you have any questions, you don't necessarily agree, or maybe you do agree with something we said, go ahead and send an email to inquiry@condovultures.com, IAQUIRY@condovultures.com. And a reminder, if you want to actually watch this discussion, go to any platform that permits for video, such as Spotify, or you can look us up on YouTube, or our handle is Condo Vultures TV. So we went through our first three stories. Now we're going to go with our second three stories. We're going to start off with David Lyons. This story, David, is coming out of CNBC. Headline: Home builders say demand is rising, but they're concerned about banking fallout. And let me read you the first 3 points of the story, and then I'll ask you to comment. Point number one, key point: home builders are starting to feel better about the market for newly built single-family homes. Point number two, it's the third straight monthly increase in builder sentiment. Point number three, sales expectations in the next 6 months, however, fell, and the industry is watching recent instability in the banking system. David, what do you make of that? Right as buyers are starting to feel confident again about maybe going ahead and trying to buy, even though mortgage rates have gone from effectively 3% to somewhere in the ballpark of 7%. Now, lo and behold, you got a banking crisis that we've been discussing. And how is that going to impact credit on the street in terms of, can somebody with iffy credit, can they get financing? So what does that mean for home builders? What does that mean for resellers? You've been on the ground in South Florida, originally from New York. So you've been on the ground in South Florida for decades. What's your take on this?
I don't know. Well, iffy credit is going to require higher deposits if you want to buy a home or a condo or whatever else. But I think as a case in South Florida, even though the developmental pace slowed a bit, somebody shot me a note the other day that said, well, there's a developmental freeze. I said, what are you talking about? There's no freeze. Developers are a Congo line outside of each city development review committee, filing new plans, buying land, whether it's near Freight Line Station or it's still a very hot marketplace compared to many of the other places. True land is at a premium. People are looking upstate, to get a cheaper land, let alone land alone. So there's just yesterday I spoke to Broward County Mayor, and I laid this out. I said, well, inflation, you got a banking crisis. What do you think? Where you're looking at a slowdown, and he said, not really, because there are so many people still lining up to come here. The demand is here. The developers are obviously biding their time a little bit because, you know, you have higher insurance rates. You also have a continuing rise in labor rates and the cost of material perennial problem for the last 3 or 4 years. But still in all, they all seem to be getting around it, particularly the developers from out of town who are coming down here from New York or coming from Texas or West, that they all want to be in Florida. So they're scoping out land, they're making their acquisitions, and if they're not going to start a project today or tomorrow, you know, they're lining up their entitlements with the expectation that the interest rate situation is going to taper off in about a year or two, and if they can't start a project now, they're going to start it in 2024 or or maybe, you know, a little bit later. But I think that speaks to confidence because ultimately, um, there's there's the belief, you know, generally speaking, we've got a stronger banking system today than we did in 2008, and obviously, the government responded very quickly over the weekend to attend to this problem with technology and crypto for you. There's a lot of sensitivity towards, you know, maintaining a strong financial system governed by strong rules, even though there was the rollback in some of the reforms in 2018. And there's a discussion in Washington right now about putting it back. Um, I think there's a stronger innate confidence in the financial system that we have today than we did back in 09 and beyond. So anyway, they're here and there's still activity and people are still, you know, looking for homes. Obviously, the people with cash are in a lot better position than the people who have to have a home or condo finance. You know, that's an important concept. They're going to be fire deposits are going to be required of those who, you know, don't know the financial strength as opposed to the people who have kids. So it's definitely an interesting phenomenon because I've been waiting for some cred. I've been waiting for filing of more bankruptcies by consumers and whatnot. And that's there it is, a little bit of an increase in personal bankruptcy filings for Chapter 13, and it's also District of Florida. That's the one where people have to pay back their money on a plan. But that's the bankruptcy numbers are nowhere near pre-COVID. So I think it speaks to the underlying strength of the economy that's low, unemployment is still low. You know, I think those points of strength are essentially what are lifting, you know, these confidence levels or keeping them at loftier levels than they could.
Interesting. A point of reference, John, before we go to you with the story, I just posted some statistics coming out of the multiple listing service for bank-owned properties. They're referred to as real estate owned or REOs. There were 140 in Broward County last year. So it's not really a big number for how large the county is, 2 million people or so. And right now there's only about 23. There's basically less than 25 REOs in Broward County. But as I said before, everything's good until it's not. So we'll have to pay attention. And I'm sure David will be on that right away when something does change. Sean, we're going to go to you with story number 2. This is coming out of Real Deal. Headline, a phenomenon. What's holding up South Florida projects? A perfect segue, I think, from what David was just discussing. Subhead, no, it's not just high interest rates on financing. That's delaying construction. First couple graphs, Sean, and then I'll ask you to comment. Developer Jerry Aguirre has plans for a 220-unit apartment complex in West Kendall, which is in the Miami area. But until next year, or maybe even 2025, the community will exist only on paper, as the site remains untouched by construction crews. And this is the developer's comment. We want to start construction, but we need to hold it. And the project is on pause due to a series of headwinds that are causing a perfect storm for developers. In the mix are rising interest rates, costlier building materials and labor, plus skyrocketing insurance premiums. The developer goes on, Gary goes on to say, we're going through all of the entitlement process, getting all the approvals in place to be ready when something gives, whether it's the construction cost or the capital market. John, what do you make of that? Is this an example, or is this leftover from the supply chain issues we had due to the pandemic, or is this somebody who's maybe dealing now with a changing banking environment? Interest rates went from 0 to effectively 5% in terms of the federal funds rate. What do you sort of make of this? And what's your opinion about a developer who's sitting there chomping at the bit, wants to start building, but is being prudent and pragmatic,
Yeah,
some would say?
and maybe the cycle is coming to an end. It could be that, and a lot of investors share this concern that perhaps we've reached the peak. There's been a tsunami of construction, tons and tons of apartments and condos in the pipeline and under construction, and perhaps with tightening financial conditions, this may not be a good time to come out to start putting shovels in the ground. And maybe in 18 more months, we will be in a recession, and it may not be a very good time to be trying to sell units or rent them out because there'll be perhaps an oversupply. So I think it's totally prudent that these developers are holding off. They're seeing signs of a perhaps market peak, tightening financial conditions, and perhaps lending institutions are also a little bit skittish. Obviously, not with the banking crisis.
Sure.
I would expect bankers now to say, "Hey, let's take a pencil to these projects and really take a close look at whether they actually work out financially, because we don't know the cost of money is going up, and we don't know if we're headed for a recession, and we need to be very cautious about lending, making construction loans to projects that may or may not be successful. And so I think it's the right approach.
I like the sounds of that. I also like the sounds of regulators getting criticized on national television and in the press. A lot of complaints coming out saying that the regulators in San Francisco, they missed Silvergate, which is the crypto bank that failed, as well as Silicon Valley. And from the way I've seen it is whenever regulators get reprimanded, they come back guns a-blazing, getting up everybody's ass. So I would anticipate you're probably going to see, the credit on the street is probably going to get very difficult to obtain as we go forward, at least until the criticism dies down. So, John Fakler, let's go to you with story number 6. This is kind of right up your alley. You're somebody who, I think I can say this, you don't like to fly. You're kind of like a train guy. You're going to be going up to New York in the summer, and rather than get on a plane and fly, you're going to sit on a train for 30 plus hours and get up to New York. So I figured I would bring this up because I think this sort of shows the future of South Florida as well as Central Florida. And I think there could be some economic impact. So I want to get your take on it. John, this is coming out of a publication that primarily writes about travel. Publication's called Time Out. So here's the headline, and here's the first couple graphs. Headline: a new high-speed train route will connect Orlando and Miami. Subhead: it'll take roughly 3 hours to connect Central and South Florida. First couple graphs, John. The United States isn't known for top-notch train travel, and I'm sure you're going to tell us about that, John. Did you take the train from Miami to New York? The United States isn't known for top-notch train travel. See the rest of the world, but a few recent developments are offering some hope for those who prefer to travel by rail. In Florida, the fastest train just launched to connect two routes of the state. Brightline, which provides modern, eco-friendly intercity rail in America, reached speeds of 130 miles an hour during testing along a 35-mile rail corridor between Orlando International Airport and Cocoa, Florida. And here's the quote: reaching 130 miles an hour isn't just another milestone to our team, but the continuation of a dream that we've been working on for several years, said Patrick Goddard, president of Brightline Trains. More importantly, this historic feat brings us one step closer to launching Brightline service between Orlando and Miami. And during tests, Brightline trains are required to test faster than their planned operating speeds. Once they're carrying passengers, the trains will travel a maximum of 125 miles an hour, more than 2 miles per minute, twice as fast as you can drive. Plus, with new tracks built along the Beachline Expressway, which is State Road 528, which is fenced in and has no grade crossings, there won't be any traffic or any stops. So, Mr. Fakler, A, would you ride this train if it can go 125 miles an hour? B, is that too fast for you because you don't like to go fast? And C, what kind of tourism and development opportunities and what will the connection be between South Florida, because this train goes through Miami, Aventura, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, West Palm Beach, and now it'll suddenly connect to Orlando.
I've been following the Brightline, the developments with Brightline since its inception, I think a few years ago. Anybody who's driven that stretch to Orlando knows it's approximately a 5-hour drive. You're talking about 3 hours now, which is huge, a huge cut. Also, this stretch that's being tested has no gates. So I don't know if how many people are familiar with Brightline, but they've had some issues with accidents at gates. They've also had delays, off and on, construction delays. So the story points out a general estimated time of the end of the year. I think that's being generous to say that it'll be ready by the end of the year. With the delays that they've had, you can pretty much add another 6 months onto that, in my opinion. So I don't, until they get the kinks out, I would be reserved about my, estimation on how good this will be for tourism, and also for commuters. But, once it's set up, I think it's going to be a great idea. Don't forget, now, compare this to what happened in California, where there was a new rail system being set up and they had all kinds of problems with it. I think it's actually been put on the back burner. Not sure if it was San Francisco to some other area, but, this is one of those rare situations where Florida's out front, as far as their construction, implementation, and ideation of this idea of having this rail from Miami to Orlando.
Hey, Mr. Fakler, you avoided the question. Would you ride this, or will
No,
this
no, no.
train go too fast?
120 miles is fine. I can, listen, this stretches on the Amtrak where it gets up there in speed. Yes, I'm been known to take Amtrak. So the speed doesn't bother me. In fact, I'd prefer it to go faster because I don't want to stay too long, and the slower the train goes, the more chances it's going to have an accident anyway.
And okay, fantastic. And for the record, it doesn't take 5 hours
Okay.
for most people live in Miami to get to Orlando. Chances are it's probably in that 3 hour
really?
range or so.
Okay.
But that's assuming you have a good run in terms of the highway patrol. But
Well, you
That's what
also
I've
drive
heard.
80 miles an
So-
hour. You're crazy with the phone,
Well, I have a comment on this.
Please.
I've been covering Brightline, and I'm also from a
Oh.
railroad family. My father, uncles, cousins were all railroaders in the Northeast. I was the only person in the family not to go into railroading as a profession. Much father tried to discourage me, even though he did get me a couple of
Nice.
summer jobs on the track gang, and it also a nighttime job as a brakeman around a shop, and it was kind of dangerous work. But look, train travel was great. I remember taking a cross-country trip between Los Angeles and New York way back in the early 1970s. I had the dining car and the sleeping car and the
I
whole
love
nine
that.
yards. It was terrific. When I was a kid, I had a free pass between Albany, New York, and New York to see ball games, the Broadway shows, and it was terrific. Beautiful scenic ride down the east bank of the Hudson River. At any rate, as for Brightline, I'm rooting for it because of my obvious bias for railroad. They have had their difficulties, obviously, with safety, but they've been spending millions on crossings and education programs, joint campaigns with law enforcement to educate the public on rail safety. Don't go walking along the tracks or running along the tracks. Don't try to beat the train across the tracks. And a lot of it's in the hands of the people who are on the ground not riding the train. And thus far, it's been a concerted campaign between among the train operators and Federal Railroad Administration to make it safe and ensure it's safe. I think they're going to probably have some difficulty between West Palm Beach and Acapulco, where the train is going to be running through a lot of those towns, some of which do not want Brightline in the early going. John might remember that. The food and they're essentially deflected in the courts. So the train is coming through, regardless of what they felt back several years ago. But it'll definitely be a terrific alternative for those who pay for it. The main problem is the fare structure. I mean, this is a transportation system for upper income people and above. The people who have to get to work every day take Tri-Rail. Fares between West Palm Beach and Miami International Airport are significantly less.
Sure.
The bright lines, by about anywhere from $15 and up per rides. Uh, it's definitely a system that is in league with the economic development. We're trying to get professional service firms and technology companies to come here, uh, trusting the fact that these higher income earners are going to be riding bright line. And according to those statistics, they have been. They've gotten back into service in November of uh, last year or the year before, after COVID hiatus. We essentially have recouped most of the riders that they had before the COVID-19 hit. So, and they've been doing a lot of joint marketing agreements.
Yes.
With towns, cities, companies, the Miami Heat. They even hold a train in Miami until the Miami Heat game is over, so people can see the Heat from up this way in Broward and Palm Beach. Guys can hop the train and come home at 11 o'clock. So, they're making their way. I came down here 43 years ago, and I saw that rail line, the Florida East Coast Railway line, but I was really disappointed that there was no passenger service among the three main cities until just several years ago. It's definitely going to be a game changer. I think the report says they're very optimistic.
Oh, nice.
Second quarter start. We'll see. Yeah.
Well, with that, we'll go ahead. We'll take our second commercial break. And when we come back, I'm going to ask each of our current and former journalists to go ahead and give us some words of wisdom as we near the end of the first quarter of 2023. We'll be right back. This is Peter Zalewski of the Condo Vultures podcast. Before I started doing these podcasts, I've been in the business of being a licensed real estate broker, a contributing columnist for the Miami Herald, as well as the Miami Real Deal, but also extra witness work in consulting. So if you are looking for an expert witness, or if you're looking for consulting services, a straight talk perspective as to what's going on in a particular marketplace, a building, or what happened previously, for whatever your situation is, whether you are an attorney, whether you are a institutional fund looking to invest, or whether you're a lender who's trying to come up with some sort of strategy and approach for your lending committee going forward, I just might be able to help you. To get a hold of me, please reach out to Peter@CondoVultures.com. That's Peter@CondoVultures.com, or give me a call to the office at 305-865-5859, 305-865-5859. Welcome back to the Miami Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Peter Zalewski from Condo Vultures. We discussed 6 stories that I handpicked that we kind of cut through and try to provide some importance and significance for you, the audience, help you understand kind of what's going on, what's really happening behind the scenes, cut through the hyperbole, if you will, that's kind of out there, especially what we find in the real estate market, especially at these times when the banking world is on the cusp of, teetering, possibly going bad or possibly being stabilized, backstop. It's an interesting time to tap into our veteran journalists and ask them for words of wisdom from a South Florida perspective. So we'll start with John. John, what are your words of wisdom?
I alluded to this a little earlier in the podcast, but I went to a real estate conference yesterday in Fort Myers. It was sold out. 1,300 people attended. It's their annual Market Trends big event, and just absolutely fascinating what's going on over there. If you'll recall, Hurricane Ian passed through in September, and billions of dollars of reconstruction money have poured into the Fort Myers, Naples area. And it is just an explosion of investments. It's just a veritable boom over there. So I know this is a podcast focused on South Florida, but I would suggest that there are incredible opportunities in Southwest Florida, where there is a significant amount of real estate development going on. In fact, Charlotte County, which is just north of Fort Myers, between Sarasota and Fort Myers, has the best-selling master plan community in the country right now. It's called Babcock Ranch, and it is absolutely booming. And the reason it's booming is because it's inland. So it's away from the coast. It's away from the surge, the storm surge and the floods, and it's on high ground. And who knew that high ground in Florida would be valuable, right? So there's now actually a push inland by a lot of builders who are looking for land that is high and dry. And so it's really fascinating what's going on over there. And of course, West Florida and Southwest Florida has the land that we don't have in South Florida. We're almost completely built out here. But in Southwest Florida and West Florida, there's still large tracts of land that are held by agricultural interests mostly, and that are available for development. So there's a real boom over there. And plus the billions of dollars in reconstruction from the hurricane, combined with the season and tourism and seasonal residents that come at this time of year, is just madness over there. So, but fantastic opportunities and a lot of business getting done, and a lot of big deals.
Wow. Talk about on the ground perspective. David, let's go to you. You made reference to the fact you got here 40 plus years ago to South Florida. David, what are your words of wisdom and advice for some of our new arrivals down here in South Florida?
Well, I think they can have a little bit more confidence in the financial institutions that we have here than maybe 12, 15 years ago. And banking in South Florida has always a hit or miss proposition. There was the ethanol crisis here in the early 90s. And then there were failures here, in the early 2000s as a result of the housing crisis. And it seems like, most of our industry now are very well informed. They understand the rules of the road, and they're careful with, how they do business. Nonetheless, I go back to that entreaty that the banker made to me earlier in this broadcast, and that was don't put all of your eggs in the basket, particularly if you're a business. Don't stack all of your money into one bank, especially if it's a lot more than $250,000. Because I don't think that the Federal Reserve or other regulators are going to be as generous across the board on deposit insurance if more of these things happen. But I think that the aspect of you're looking across the spectrum. There are community banks here that are pretty strong. There are subsets of regional banks from elsewhere that are here, and then of course we've got the behemoth banks that are here as well. But there are a lot of different choices for people to plant their holdings. Just don't do it. Don't place them all in one institution. That's probably the best advice I think I get right now, particularly those who are coming down here looking to invest in real estate, buy multiple properties, or just start a business.
Great words of wisdom. Mr. Fakler, what are your words of wisdom? And I don't want to hear about the New York Jets versus the Miami Dolphins, because I know that's where you're going to go.
No.
It's too simple.
I saw an interesting report just a few days ago. I should say, listen to, I think it was CNBC. They were talking about, because this move to remote work looks like it's permanent, there is a glut of office supply in New York and other major cities. What they're saying is that one fix for that is that they may turn these office buildings into residential. Could be condos, obviously. And if that is, I'm very curious to see if that would translate to South Florida. We got, of course, a different office market here, office commercial market. But, if that happens and they start to, turn these office buildings into residential, it's a possibility it could help drive down the pricing. We've got inventory issues, of course. So the inventory is still tight in South Florida. But if that was to happen, we got some more inventory on the street. Maybe that'll help drive down prices. For buyers, I should say.
Interesting. Yeah, of course. Okay. Let me go ahead and thank our all the members of our panel for our podcast. We have John Gruss. John was a journalist for 25 years, 20 years of which were in the state of Florida. John has a public relations and marketing company called Gruss Communications. You can reach him at grusspr.com. Let me also thank David Lyons. David's a business reporter over at the South Florida SunSentinel. He's been a journalist 40 plus years. At one point, he was my boss, taught me a lot about journalism. And if you want to reach David, you can reach him at D like David, V like Victor, Lyons at sunsentinel.com. That's DV Lyons, LYONS at sunsentinel.com. And then finally, let me thank the New York Jets fan who's posing down here in Miami. John, let's see that hat.
One more time.
Want to put that hat on? Yeah. And finally, we're going to thank John Fakler, who's a journalist for 20 plus years. He wrote about white collar crime. He also wrote about business topics, including did restaurant reviews. Right now, he does public relations and consulting. If you want to reach John, you can send him an email at fakler@consultant.com, FAKLER@consultant.com. That's singular. And I'm Peter Zalewski. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to send us a comment or ask us a question at inquiry@condovultures.com, INQUIRY@condovultures.com. Until next time, take care of yourself. We'll catch up soon. Ciao, ciao.
Don't buy a South Florida condo, discounted or distressed, before taking a Condo Vultures correction tour. CondoVultures.com offers weekly bus and walking tours that focus on educating buyers on the how-tos of identifying discounted condos, analyzing the opportunities, and purchasing units. Every tour attendee receives a list of all condo projects in a particular market, a market assessment handout, and unmatched expert analysis. For more information on the condo correction tours, please visit condovultures.eventbrite.com.